Welcome to this lecture of the Environmental Ethics Initiative. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Peter Kareiva, who is our speaker for the day. For me as a scientist, he's most famous for his work in ecology, especially spatial ecology, where he handles the questions of where things are based on both data and theory, which doesn't always happen with every scientist you meet. He can trace his academic genealogy through any number of directions because he's worked at so many different institutions through the years. And he is currently the chief scientist for the Nature Conservancy. Now I'll editorialize for just a moment. The Nature Conservancy, as an environmental community, is the most reasonable one in the world. And his job as chief scientist is to figure out how humans and the rest of life can share the planet. And he has some new ideas to consider and that are happening now of including more in decisions regarding how we handle life on Earth. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Peter Kareiva.
I've worked at so many places because I get run out of them all. And so my boss is here in the audience now. I'll have to be careful. I want to start with Rachel Carson. In 6 months from now, it'll be the 50th anniversary of Silent Spring. And, you know, it's kind of a myth. We all like to believe that we as people can make a difference. But this was one woman who changed the world. She really did. When she published Silent Spring, you know, there was very little environmental awareness. There was very little, we didn't have the Endangered Species Act, the Water Quality Act, any of that. And she ended up speaking to Kennedy's cabinet. She went on national TV, CBS Reports on a Sunday night, and set the record for the number of viewers ever at that stage. And she did it sort of against all odds. She wanted to be a research scientist. In those days, women did not get faculty positions. Her father died. She grew up on a farm. Her father died when she was pretty young. Her mother was sick, and she needed security. She had to take care of her mom. And so she worked for the federal government as translating technical scientific reports for the things for the public. And that's how she got this path. But, you know, just to recognize how far we've come, you know, before her book, this was a full-page ad in Time magazine. And, you know, DDT is good for me with a housewife dancing in the kitchen. We know that. And really, you can trace all this legislation to her. She testified before Congress several times, the cabinet. She had a huge impact by writing one book. Sold out immediately. Had several printers. It was run in New Yorker as an article. She was so, she wasn't charismatic, but when attacked, she was cool-headed. And attacked she was. She was attacked by industry. She was attacked because she never married. She was attacked for some deeply personal reasons. But we have this great legislation, and this is the model for the world. And I work in China. China has tried to copy these acts. They have their own environmental protection agency, CEPA, Chinese Environmental Protection Agency. And, but now if you pause 50 years forward and think about where we are now, I'm not going to give you a lot of data, but I think if you were to, if you're honestly ask yourself, you read the newspapers, the environmental and conservation movement is weaker than it's been in 40 years. No question about it. It's weaker than it's been in 40 years. It's bipartisan, it's hostile, it doesn't get much traction. Maybe everybody in here cares about it, but that's not enough. And we have a story. We've created the story. The narrative that we've created is this narrative. You know, the Koch brothers funded an awful lot of advertisements and scientists and institutes that were what are called climate deniers. They came out against dealing with the climate. They spent millions and millions of dollars. The narrative among environmentalists is that these evil corporate people outspent the good guys, and they won by sheerly pouring money into it. Where's the recent study? Not true. You know, there's a lot of wealthy philanthropy that supports conservation and environmental issues, and in fact, it was the pro-climate action outspent the co-brothers. Outspent them on the campaign. It wasn't just money. We're doing something wrong. And so, the first part of this talk, I'm going to talk about what we do wrong. And I'm going to say that it's sort of that we've been our own worst enemy in moving forward a thoughtful conservation agenda. And then I'll get out of my own sort of pessimism and give you what I think is the path forward. Let's start with the pristine wilderness and exclude people. And to be honest, this is how I got turned on to conservation. I was like a high school kid, and I went on a canoeing, backpacking, foraging trip up Algonquin National Park, and got to see moose and bear, and had a wonderful time. I was away from people, and that to me was heaven. And the whole notion to me was to get away from everything. And that's certainly this notion of pristine wilderness where you get away captures a lot of us and is an inspiration for a lot of us. And there's value to it, but there's also some myths to it. And I'm just going to, this is Utah, so let's talk about Edward Abbey. If you haven't read it, Desert Salvatore was written. Edward Abbey's a famous environmentalist writer. He spent 2 years working at Arches National Monument, and he wrote this treatise about how wonderful it was to be in this untouched wilderness all by himself. And if you go to the second chapter, I think it's the second chapter of the book, the last paragraph of the second chapter, I may get a word or two wrong here, but he basically concludes it by reflecting on, he's looking up at the night stars, and he's by himself, and he says, oh, how beautiful it is. I see all the stars in the night. There are no people around. Not a single soul have I seen, and no people around for 20 miles. Oh, the loveliness of being alone, the beauty of being alone. That's the book. Look at his personal diary. His personal diary, he said, oh my God, what have I done? I'm so lonely. There's a few obscenities in there. I'm so lonely. Why is Rita was his wife, gone back to Hoboken? He doesn't even mention it in his book. The second year he had been so lonely that he had his family out there with him. But he actually writes the whole book as though he's by himself. But he couldn't do it by himself. How about the pristine wilderness? Why did I put this here? He also writes the book that the scene is there's nothing, that Arches is perfect, and there's no touch of humanity. While he was there were 29 nuclear tests that he could see in the sky. It was Operation Plum Bomb. And so there are nuclear bombs going off that he could see 29 times, and he doesn't mention them in his honest journalism. Yeah. Going back in time, another person I like to pick on, Thoreau. So, you know, if you were to pick the picture of Thoreau, Walden Pond, this person who goes in a cabin, and what a noble man to go out and really be in touch with nature. His mother came and did his laundry every weekend. You know, I could be mountain man if my mother came and did my laundry every weekend too. So there's a lot of, if not lying, distortion. Why does this matter? Because then when we go and do our conservation, it becomes the model for what we do. And it goes over and over again. We've created parks as set-asides and been pretty insistent in many cases on excluding people. This is a Uganda park that was set up, and it's heralded as a great national park for Uganda. Tremendous wildlife. It really does seem like a good idea. But to maintain the park, they have armed guards. Heavily armed guards, that's the Army Guards, and that's a poacher that they've arrested for killing some wildlife. Do you want conservation based on an armed force? That's not conservation. And in fact, this was so unpopular that Uganda overturned it and let the native indigenous tribes back in. So then when they let the native indigenous tribes back in, what happened? The tribes had never done what I'm about to show you until before this park. They started slaughtering wildlife, not for food, but just because suddenly they thought of wildlife as the enemy, because of wildlife they've been kicked off their lands. Now, I've given this talk, versions of this talk earlier, and people in the audience said, yeah, but that was 10 years ago. It's all better now. We don't do that anymore. 2010, most conservation organizations supported, the Nature Conservancy did not, but most conservation organizations and the UK government created the world's largest marine protected area, Chegas Island marine protected areas. I think it's like 20 islands, 20 tiny islands, of which that's one. Beautiful, beautiful islands, but excluding the native Chagosians. And they had been moved off originally for a military base. They shut down the military base. The native islanders wanted to come back, and the conservation effort said, no, this is going to be a park. And it's in an international court now. I think it's a blemish on the conservation movement. We shouldn't have done it. I'll mention, not only is this is much more than bad public relations, it's actually terrible science. We know better. I mean, and I'll come at the very end of the talk about that, about why we know better. It just doesn't work. The best thing they could do is let the people back on if they wanted to do conservation. So it's not a thing of the past. The second thing is this jobs versus nature dichotomy. And I first saw this because I was an expert witness at the spotted owl trials in the Great Northwest. And I was a young sort of punk professor and thought I was at Edward Abbey or something, saving the world. And I just had to testify in federal court. And I had kids that were ages 2 and 4 at the time. And it really, in the back of the courtroom, in the federal court, where the loggers lined up with their kids over their shoulders, and I could carry their kids like this with their arms to scare away you carry your kids. And with signs around, and jostle the kids, and the kids would cry, the sign said, you care more about owls than my kids having the next meal. And here I was, eco-hero, warrior, testifying to save the spotted owls, and there was this different narrative, this different story along the back wall. And it was a legitimate story. It made me think, and it's not, we've allowed this to happen. These are just signs I've collected from Save Fish, Ruin Humans, that's from California to Sacramento, endangered farmers, marine protected area equals eco-apartheid, save a logger, eat an owl. But you can just go around and around in different conservation battles. These are all from the United States. And find the conservation battle framed in this way, which is not a good way to have it turn out. And, if you see that, this is, I don't like to show too much data, but this is a Gallup Poll. And the point in this is really asking, would you give up some economic development to protect the environment? And in 1985, 60% of the Americans would. The green line is crossed, and that's no longer the case, and it's over 60% now. It's absolutely flip-flopped. So right now, it's just the opposite of what it used to be. It's above all else the economy over the environment. Well, I don't like the question, because it's not the economy over the environment. It's the wrong question. You get both. But it's also unfortunate that the opinions switch. The next thing, what I call, I could also call this doom and gloom, sort of and here I'll even talk about my own organization and a lot of my ecology friends. If you go onto the website of most environmental groups and you look up a habitat, it could be a river, a lake, a beach, a forest, I wouldn't be surprised if you saw the word fragile. Fragile lake, fragile ecosystem, fragile desert, fragile, 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 fragile. I maintain scientifically, that's not the case. If anything, nature's resilient. We can damage it. I'm not saying we don't damage nature. We do. We have to find out when we damage it so much that it breaks. But it's not some delicate flower fragile. It could be quite resilient. We resisted that message in order to paint a story that whenever you go out and you do something, you're creating some sort of apocalyptic environmental thing. Okay. So fragile planet, fragile, fragile, fragile. And the reason that is a significant misstatement is because if you believe that things are really that delicate, that it's so easy to break the world, so to speak, You're going to draw your line in the sand, and you're not going to negotiate or even have a conversation. You're going to have those armed guards. You're going to take that strong a stand. You won't have a dialogue. Examples. Their book came out, At the Ocean. No, there was a paper published in Science, a premier magazine, that extrapolated that if we keep fishing, by 2050 we'll run out of fish in the ocean. Newspapers covered it all over. It was subsequently debunked in a later paper in Science, using exactly the same data. Even one of the same scientists involved. It was debunked. They had made a mistake. Nobody heard that. All they heard was by 2050 we'll run out of fish. Empty skies. There was neotropical migratory birds were supposed to be falling out of the sky because we're cutting down tropical rainforests. Front cover of Audubon Society. Papers published subsequently turned out half the species were increasing, half were decreasing. Not quite that bad. Over and over again. Some of you, if you're more scientifically minded, there's a paper that came out this year by scientists named He and Hubble that reevaluated how we estimate extinction rates. And it showed that the way we were estimating extinction rates was exaggerating them upward. It didn't say we didn't have an extinction problem. It just said our estimates were too high. Those poor scientists got attacked. And it's because they didn't want to hear any news that was a little bit better. And you can follow that in the scientific literature. I became aware of sort of the notion of this because when I was more of a basic scientist, I studied Mount St. Helens. And you'll remember this. This is that was called Pumice Plains. And after the eruption, it was totally barren landscape. This is one of the first lupin plants to come back. And actually, if you scanned out, you'd see dozens of scientists around about to descend on it and study it, and it's now grown, and there have been a lot of scientists. But the point was, as a hobby, even as I moved on in my career, I keep going back to Mount St. Helens. And the recovery story there is remarkable. And that was the equivalent of 3 atomic bombs. That's a big drop. But there are other stories of recovery, damage and recovery. That's, of course, the natural damage. This is the hydrogen bomb in the Bikini Atoll. It boiled the ocean, vaporized entire island, boiled the ocean, destroyed everything. A scientific expedition went back 3 or 4 years ago and looked for coral. They found more coral that was there than ever before, in terms of biomass and number of species. Both just the volume and the number of species. Much more than ever before. They wouldn't want to eat the fish, but still, this is not a story of fragility. This is not a picture of, oh my God, nature's fragile. We damage nature, and there's some capacity to come back. In my own, sort of personal life, like many families, my family, packed me up in a car and we went to visit the great national parks. When we went to visit Yellowstone, there was no chance of seeing something like this with wolves and a bison. You could go to Yellowstone now and count on a wolf experience. I mean, you could actually have a very, very good chance, good, healthy, vigorous population of wolves, elk, grizzly bears coming back, bison. And when I went there as a kid with my family, that was not part of the Yellowstone experience. That's a pretty significant conservation recovery story. You all know this iconic figure. This is, of course, the Deepwater Horizon. But again, I'm going to show you something about resistance to good news. Jay Lubchenco, early on, showed this pie chart. National news. It's on all the national channels. It's a press conference. And in the pie chart, what was discovered was a lot of the oil was being consumed by bacteria. Much more than anybody expected. And there were 2 reasons. A lot of our expectations were based on cold water spills like Exxon. So the water is much warmer, more activity, more metabolic activity. And secondly, there's a really heavy natural seepage in the Gulf and a rich bacterial community there, so they were there, ready, and adapted those microbes to basically eat a lot of the oil. So this is just a scientific fact. I mean, it didn't say there was no damage. There's other damage. But a surprisingly rapid metabolism of the oil. She gave that, and she got attacked of being a corporate, shill, and just being bought out by the corporations. And I had dinner with her shortly after this. She was actually personally sort of wounded because her old colleagues from academia didn't trust her. They attacked her. Jane Lubchenco is one of the founders and heroes of modern marine conservation. She founded the Leopold program, so the university professors anyway can, if they apply for it, can accept it, can be better environmental leaders. There's no way she sold out to any corporations. But we didn't like the good news. Yeah, there's bad news, but there was also good news. We didn't like it. It just didn't fit with our simplistic thing of doom and gloom. And that sort of doom and gloom, some of my favorite critics of the environmental movement, as they remark, they say if Martin Luther King had been an environmentalist, he would not have given I Have a Dream speech. He would have given I Have a Nightmare speech. And I think he's right. I think that critique is right. So I've challenged the wilderness idea, the jobs versus nature, sort of this fragile nature apocalypse. I want to end up with sort of what I call knee-jerk rejection of technology. So sometimes environmentalists and conservationists can just seem like they're anti-modern. They don't like anything modern, and especially technology. Genetically modified organisms is a good example of that. The National Academy of Science has done so many reports on genetically modified organisms. And it's essentially said over and over again, and this is something I've worked on personally, even in the field, that it's not the modification of the technology that's a problem, it's the product. You evaluate the product with a sort of cost-benefit analysis, and some of the products have risks, and some of them have benefits that are really very, very big. But there is a movement that's just absolutely anti-GMO. As a conservationist, you should worry about it because some of the GMOs could really help us in the environment. I show one of them here, it's cassava. Cassava has been genetically engineered, not by a corporation, but by university scientists funded by Bill Gates, because he's interested in feeding the world. And it's been modified so that it's resistant to disease, and it's boosted its protein and nutritional content almost twofold. And those genetically modified cassavas then have real potential for doing no environmental damage. They wouldn't need pesticides that grow without water, so you don't have to use up valuable water in Africa and do a lot of good. But we will have groups saying, don't put them in Africa. There'll be groups that just will not accept that. Knee-jerk anti-technology. I saw it with, I worked for NOAA Fisheries and worked on some of the dam issues. And a lot of dams block fish migration and do it in a way that harms the stocks, harms the spawning, and really, really kind of ruins it for the fish. But you could also engineer dams if you spend enough money, and it takes a lot of money. So Bonneville Power Authority spent billions of dollars re-engineering dams so that fish could get around them. I mean, it's just amazing how much money, the devices they did. They redid the turbines. They put bypasses, ladders, all sorts of things. An enormous amount of money. One of my jobs is to study the data. When I studied the data on these dams, I published papers and good journals on it, and basically concluded that if you even remove the dams, it wouldn't help the fish at all, because that wasn't the problem for these re-engineered dams. They've been so well re-engineered that the fish were fine. In fact, the survival of the fish going through the dams is higher than the survival of the fish in wild rivers. And that data still stands. Now, again, not all dams. You call them high-tech, highly engineered dams. And nobody wanted to hear that. The environmental groups, the only two that I know, I only going to name the names of the ones that didn't, was Defenders of Wildlife, which was one who had a really good chief scientist, and the Nature Conservancy. I wasn't working for them then, but they also, we've always been pretty conservative scientifically. We're the only two U.S. conservation groups that did not sign on to this ad. This is a full-page ad in the New York Times. Timeline to extinction. Without prompt action, Snake River Chinook salmon will be extinct by 2017. Essentially, that's something qualified. Will be extinct by 2017. If you don't take out these Snake River dams, This fish will be extinct by 2017. My job had me going around to town hall meetings and having to talk to audiences. I would often offer to bet on my house on this, because I'd seen this, and I'd say, bet you my house, the dams aren't going to come out. I guarantee the Chinook are going to be around. It's 2012 now, dams are not going to go out. I guarantee you the Chinook are going to be around. Absolutely guarantee it. Total overstatement. In fact, here's the data on the population. So this was, they were doing really, really bad, and I went to work for NOAA, and they really came bad. This is true. I'm not positive of it. The timeline's right. I went to work for TNC. It took a while for the people I left behind to figure out how to do it. But anyway, they're not going extinct. There's plenty of problems with salmon, but it's not those particular, it's other dams. There are other dams that are a problem, but they weren't talking about the other dams. It was those. And there are other issues: pollution, logging, overfishing, hatcheries, and so forth. But not the dams. So in some sense, this is what I call the, it speaks for itself. I don't say words. So my point is so often the conservation environmental movement can be seen this way. Don't do this, anti-growth, dogmatic, purist, zealous, and the romantic pastoralism for this pristine wilderness doesn't exist. Never did anything. And that's the way a lot of the world sees it. And I'm saying the future is this. These are the words: restore, reconnect, people, communities, growth and opportunity, technology for nature, green infrastructure, green business. That's the future for conservation that will work. And let's get concrete about it. So the first thing is this new geological epoch. Scientists have gotten together and already given it a name because our footprint on the planet is so huge: the Anthropocene. And I know it seems a little bit depressing to some that no matter where you go in the world, you can find the footprint of humans. Even if you're out in the wilderness, if you look at the fatty tissue of the birds or the fish, there'd be pesticides. There would be a signature of humans no matter where you go. And that might be depressing, but get over it. There's still a lot of beauty and an awful lot of nature and wildness out there. But you don't have to overstate it. So this is, you've all seen these. Just look at any photos of the night planets. This is a neat website. So if you go to the NASA website, you can just screen through these. It's a really cool website to see all the night photos. And you can actually go through it, look at different years, and see what's happening in the Amazon and Mongolia, places like that. Less known is, look at the world's shipping lanes. You think of the ocean as being this big open place. But like the northern right whale, the right whale is not hunted anymore. The right whale's in trouble because it gets hit by ships. You look out in the ocean and you don't see that many ships, but the shipping lanes are that dense that that's actually the issue with the right whale. Direct hits by ships. Cities. We become totally urbanized. So that, now 80% of Americans live in cities. What was it, Teresa? Was it 90% of Utahns are in cities? Is that right? From the newspaper? So, which is, you think of 90% the population of Utah is in cities.
Within 1.1% of the land.
Yeah. So, we're an urban. We're not a natural, we're an urban culture. So one thing is, find some beauty in nature in that urban. This is one of my favorite parks. I can find other cities. This is the Golden Gate Park, at the base of the, runs to the shoreline here. That's the beach right there of the Golden Gate Bridge. Look at that park in the middle of San Francisco. It's if you go in there and walk through there, there's places there that are regularly coyotes go. You can't take dogs off leashes. It's not because the normal reason for the leash laws is because the dogs get off leash and the coyotes will get them. And it's just a spectacular park and much beloved by the city members. Much used and much beloved. And you have the birds of prey, the peregrine falcons in the middle of downtown San Francisco. This is near San Jose Airport. It looks even better than this now. This is a restoration project. There's a river called the Guadalupe River. When I first started teaching in that area, you go down there and just see syringes and and just enormous trash. They've replanted the riparian zone, a lot of birds come back, and now they have an endangered steelhead. Steelhead in the river that I showed there. And in fact, you could go there and regularly see steelhead. And you would never thought that in 10 years, a restored river. People love it. People take walks along the river. They love it. So let's treasure and embrace nature in our cities. It's really important to do it. So it's not just nature out there in Yellowstone. It's nature in the cities. Broaden the constituency. You know, essentially the conservation and environmental movement has been a very narrow sector of our society. It's been all white and very, very wealthy upper middle class. And we got an ugly history. I tell this history, and people get mad at me, but you have to be honest to the history. You know, John Muir did not think very highly of non-white people at all. This is not lifted out of context. He said these things many times over in many different ways. And you might say, well, why are you doing this? Why am I telling you this? Well, because you go to an environmental justice meeting with African Americans, they know this. They know these quotes. We have to admit to that. And you know, when Yellowstone was set up, you know, that's Uganda story is not just us. When we set up Yellowstone, we sent an army troop in, and we killed 300 Native Americans to get the tribe out. Killed 300. So we have a little bit of an ugly history ourselves, and it's important to admit to that ugly history as we move forward, if we want to broaden the constituency. And I think everybody is aware of this, the demographic shift that's underway. What's expected is by 2050, whites will be the minority in the United States. Whites will be the minority. And so how's the conservation movement reach out to the non-white community? We were asking that question by having focus groups in inner cities in Oakland, New York City, Miami, and San Antonio. So it's essentially African American and Hispanic. Ages 13 to 7, ages 15 to 18. And in these focus groups, and I have all the transcripts, so I haven't misrepresented this here. We asked them, the kids, what do you think about when you think about a person, an environmentalist, a conservationist? And that quote there just says it all. The person is a girl. She wears a lot of green. She preaches. Over and over again, incidentally, the word preaching came up. Preaching about recycling. She is white, she has money. Is this person nice? She's nice, she's uptight. Wouldn't want to have her at a party. And a lot of conservationists and environmentalists can be real downers in conversations by coming across that way and not connecting to different communities. Not good. We instituted a program, a young woman actually who grew up in South Carolina, and her father was a real social activist in education in South Carolina. That's how it got passed on to her. Started this program we called LEAF, but it basically goes to high schools in cities, and to those high schools, reaches out to them, it gives the kids a chance to work for us. It's not actually just an education program. They get paid a salary to do real work on Nature Conservancy land, usually for scientists, collecting data, recording data, sometimes doing restoration projects. It's an enormously successful project. I spend at least a couple days every summer with the kids, and it's probably one of the most inspiring things I do, to see what happens. And it's not just storytelling. I mean, you really see the kids getting out in nature, and they love it. You change their lives. But here are some of the quotes from them. Communities that felt like they've been left behind with the conservation. But to get quantitative about it, many of you would realize that the United States is behind in science and technology. And there's a national federal program to create more scientists and engineers. Because like China and India are producing many more. It hurts our economic competitiveness. The national average then is 6% of college graduates are in the sciences or engineering. We did a follow-up of our LEAF alumni. It was greater than 30%. That's a huge success rate. In fact, there's all sorts of federal programs. No federal program can match that, could even come close to it. And the reason is, it's not the science and technology, it's getting out and engaged, physically being involved in it. And interestingly, when you talk to them about, unlike their parents, we do a survey, and they're not environmentalists because this is a somewhat serious, but they're more of an environmentalist than their parents in recognizing that it's a somewhat serious problem. Almost 2/3 of them that there's no neighborhood parks or places where they grew up. So they feel that as a deficiency, that there's no parks or places where they grew up. We should be providing, as conservation environmentalists, we should correct that. Last thing I'm going to talk about as sort of moving forward, so this broadening constituency, talk about something a little bit more unsettling maybe. Working with corporations. Now, if any of you have taken ecology or been ecologists, you've probably come across the notion of keystone species. Species that are strongly interactive in the ecosystem and are actually shaping. In Utah, it would be cougars. So if you go to watersheds with cougars versus watersheds without cougars, the whole vegetation, the streams, the sedimentation are fundamentally different. In the Bering Sea, it's killer whales. And with and without killer whales, you have totally different marine mammal and fishery communities. In the Rocky Intertidal, it's starfish, the famous work with starfish, is it? Well, if you step back and take that same view and look at the global ecosystem, global corporations are keystone species. They're species that shape what the ecosystems of the world looks like. You would not go manage Yellowstone and not pay attention to wolves. You wouldn't do it. Well, we can't be managing the planet and not pay attention to global corporations. It's unscientific. It's like neglecting a major force. Secondly, a lot of the companies have become interested. So 80% of the Fortune 500 companies have some sort of commitment to sustainability. It's not all greenwashing, by any means. They may not be doing it right. Sometimes they don't know how to do it. But they still do issue publicly available sustainability data. I've read all of their reports. They're a little bit too much just about energy, frankly. Not enough about a broader view of ecology. So it's a lot of it's just about energy. But we can build off of it. There's still a serious effort there. What type of things can you do? Two things, I think. One is what we call development by design. And that's how do you meet our economic and energy needs, but also meet conservation objectives. And the second thing is, can you change corporate practices in a way that makes business sense and environmental sense? So you engage with corporations those two ways. How do you meet an energy need? And the second thing is, how do you change their business practices? Let's make that real. This is the planned dams in South America right now. These are serious. These are going to the governments and say what dams they have planned. So they have over 2,000 new dams planned in South America. Over 2,000 in the next 10 years. Those are going to interrupt the flow of almost 700 free-running rivers. A traditional environmental thing would sit there and say, no dams. I sit there and say, how much energy do you need to get from these dams? How much hydropower do you need? Does your country need? Give me that number. Now let me work with you and design your dams and place your dams so that it does the least damage to fish. You can do that scientifically. In some cases, you can meet all their energy needs without actually doing any damage. In other cases, you will do some damage, but you can really minimize it. You can minimize it extraordinarily. And there'll be a paper published this week that talks about doing this on the Mekong River with real numbers. You see how that's a different question? That's not, stop, no dams. It's, okay, you need energy, let's work with you. We'll help you get your energy. We'll help you get your energy in a way that doesn't do you damage. It's a totally different conservation approach. This is one of the companies we work with is Rio Tinto in Mongolia. How did we approach them? This is the map they gave us of where in Mongolia the light blue and the purple, the different shades, the dark purple, the light purple, and the blue, are all Rio Tinto sites in Mongolia. Either with their mines, or they're exploring, or they're applying to do mines. Also, there's a lot of sites. That's a fair bit of area. So they gave us that map. And then our scientists went and created this map, which they hadn't done. That's all the other mining companies. So when you look at that, it's, I mean, a lot of this is copper and gold. When you look at that, you say, my God, Mongolia is just going to be one big mine. Well, we took that to Rio Tinto and said, obviously, this is going to devastate Mongolia. You're going to get lots of obstacles. It's just not going to work. At some point, the government's going to step in. Can we figure out a way to do this sensibly so that there's some mining, some economic development, but you don't damage the best area? Mongolia is beautiful grasslands. Heavily grazed system, but really light population density, and it's one of the most spectacularly, amazing ecosystems on the planet that I've been to. Beautiful, beautiful country. More wild horses than there are people in Mongolia. But so our pitch to Rio Tinto is work with us to set up a system where you avoid some areas. If you go to other areas, you change your practices and minimize your damage. You have some options with copper and gold mining. And then if you do damage, offset it. Give some money and for protection and for doing things elsewhere. But it's not a do not mine. It's let's negotiate. And I think it's doable. We'll see. Dow, is a different thing. Dow is not about mining. This is from Dow's own PowerPoint presentation about our partnership and how they see themselves, but they're a huge company. Over 30 countries, 37 countries there, and expanding. They're looking at all sorts of new countries. Some of their chemical plant that we work with them in Texas, 15,000 employees at one plant. It's like a little city. And so how do they see it? They see it as strategic for business for all these reasons. They see it as, let's think about our business practices in the context of, we need ecosystem services. They need water. They need clean water too. They don't want the communities to be hostile to it, so stakeholder buy-in. A lot of their activities require permitting processes. So this is what they want us to help them think about. And specifically, here's their Freeport plant. And they have an area in their Freeport plant that's Oyster Creek. It's up at the top of the picture. And most of their plants in their Freeport operation are totally protected by super levees. This area is not. And what we work with them to sit there and say is, how about protecting, there's an enormous amount, this area right in there is natural wetlands and marshes. How about using those and maintaining them and restoring them to reduce storm surge? There's good science about how wetlands and marshes reduce storm surge and can be even more effective than levees. And so we do an economic analysis of it, an ecological and modeling analysis of it, and we'll see how the numbers come out. But at least we got them in a dialogue. Instead of just putting up concrete, they're willing to consider that big green area and making that part of their business operation for reducing storm surge, instead of having to turn into the land be turned over for some other type of development. We'll see how it goes. So, another way of putting that is valuing nature is a good investment. I mean, look at the mortgage crisis. Those are bad investments. Nature's a pretty solid investment. It's very, very substantial. And one of our best examples of that is this phenomenon that we've created. It's called waterfalls. The idea is simple. People in the city need clean water, invest upstream in the ecosystems to protect those ecosystems, and then those ecosystems deliver clean water. So we established a Keystone Water Fund. It started with $21,000. That's all we had, $21,000 to start investing. We got breweries, florists, hydropower companies, water suppliers, and eventually taxpayers to support it. We've now built that from $21,000 up to $12 million. It generates $1 million a year that we can spend on conservation upstream, and it delivers clean water. It's investing in nature for people, for clean water. It's been demonstrated so successful that we've now interested the International Development Bank and FEMSA, which is a big bottling company, in creating a water funds, money to create 32 more water funds in South America. Haven't created it yet, we're in the process of it. They'll be a little bit different in each of them, but it's a pretty solid idea. You're not doing conservation just to have wilderness out there. You're keeping those intact systems upstream. And it's cheaper to do that than to build a treatment plant. Cheaper to do that than build a treatment plant, and you get all the other benefits. I think it's a replicable model. I think this will spread. I think this will work really well in Asia. A little bit more problem in Africa because you need some money to invest. Asia has money to invest. Latin America has money to invest. Africa has no money. So we have to figure something out for Africa. Another example. This is a joint partnership between Nature Conservancy and NOAA. It costs $1 million to restore a mile of oyster reefs. And you actually put the oysters out in these bays. It's a lot of physical labor. $1 million for a mile, which might seem expensive. I don't think it's that expensive. We have an ambition of restoring maybe 100 or 1,000 miles in the Gulf. Maybe we should do it. Might be $1 billion, but in the past, human civilizations have done things like built the Great Wall of China and the pyramids. Well, nature restoration on the scale of those giant architectural things would be amazing. They would create jobs. They would protect you. These oyster reefs create the sand for the beaches. They're nursery grounds for the fish. You eat the oysters, and they protect you against storms. And we've done this program, and you should, so we hire people to do it. And this is a Vietnamese community that we hired to help restore the oyster reefs. And they're just, again, it's like those leaf kids. So grateful. And we're doing an economic analysis. I actually think that in terms of economic vitality, it's a good economic model for the Gulf, although we haven't finished the analysis yet. But it's an amazing way to do conservation. So I'll end with this. The last reason to value nature may be the most fundamental of all. And it needs to be much more part of the conservation dialogue than this notion of wilderness out there, nature out there. So these are petroglyphs. And it's obvious we humans have always been connected to nature. Some of the natural history details of the petroglyphs is amazing. They notice things about species, sexual differences, behavior, and so forth. And that connection to nature, I think, is real. It's biological, it's real. You also know that increasingly our life is disconnected from nature. So today's college freshmen, have experienced 1/10 of what my generation did in terms of being out in nature when they grew up. 1/10 on average. And it's just getting progressively more and more exaggerated that way. There are studies out there, this is an emerging scientific field, that are beginning to show that this experience, a connection with nature, affects your feeling of well-being, your ability to handle stress, your ability to handle depression, your ability to focus, your performance on cognitive tests, your memory, all sorts of things. Collectively, it's a little weak. Science is a little weak. It's getting better and better every year. I'll just show you one experiment because we're starting to get really serious about asking this question. And when you show brain scans, you know it's serious, but I'll just tell you this experiment. And this is so German. So in Germany, a bunch of professors got German students, it was Heidelberg University, and they brought them in and they stressed them. They stressed them by giving them a math test. And while they were taking the test, they said, "You're going too slow, you're going too slow, that's wrong, that's wrong." You can just see Germans doing this. And they had 3 treatments. Kids that lived in nature, kids that recently lived in nature but moved to the city, and kids that had never been in nature. And they did brain scans to see what parts of their brain were active, whether it was a portion of the brain that would reflect stress or cognition. And they did blood chemistry to look at cortisol and stress hormones. And they found dramatic differences. Dramatic differences. The kids with the natural experience were able to handle stress and not feel stress. So there are now PhD theses going on one committee where it's getting even more experimental, where you take a group of kids, and they come from the same school, and you split them. And one of them goes to computer camp, and the other one goes to nature camp. And you do before test and after test. And those are starting to come. But it's not so surprising. We are part of nature. And by civilization, we've been totally detached from nature. I think in the end, I could be totally off my rocker. But I think 10 years from now, we might look back and say, one of the best reasons there is for conservation, just for our own psychological well-being. And lastly, the power of community. This brings me to why that Chagos thing was so wrong. Eleanor Ostrom, the first and only woman to win an economic Nobel Prize, won it for looking at resource management. Resource management works if communities are involved. She studied marine protected area and forestry. And if local communities are involved, it works. If it's imposed by national governments and there's not local people living there, it doesn't work. Flat out, empirical result for which she won a Nobel Prize. That's why the Chagos thing is so dumb. We're excluding the native people from the islands to get this protected area, and it's the worst management practice we could do, and we even know it. They gave somebody the Nobel Prize for figuring it out. What are you doing? These are volunteers that came out for our oyster restoration in the Gulf. The willingness of the local community to volunteer knocked our socks off. We couldn't handle how many volunteers. They just wanted to go and do something. I mean, because they could see the results of what they did. At the end of the day, they could see an oyster reef. Well, not at the end of the day. At the end of 2 weeks, they could see an oyster reef. So I'll end with 2 paintings. I would say traditional, 2 of my favorite paintings. I love these paintings. If people know this painting, Picasso, Spanish Civil War. So this is my depiction of how the environmental and conservation movement has been for the last 20 years. Litigation, fighting, stop this. That's a great painting. Picasso. And this is how the environmental movement needs to be. This is another one of my favorite paintings called The Peaceable Kingdom by Edward Hicks. He's a Quaker minister. But, the indigenous Native Americans, the colonials, the wildlife, all living peacefully together. So those 2 pictures represent, again, the old conservation and the new conservation, and I'll end it there. Thanks. Glad to take questions.
So, in replacing the old story of fragility with one of resilience, my question is, how do we talk about that in such a way that people don't interpret it then as a free pass? Like, oh, I can pollute, I can bomb, and hell, in 30 years, it will all grow back to be fantastic. So, it doesn't matter what I do now. So how do we negotiate that attitude with this new narrative of resiliency?
So that's a really good question. I've been asked that before. First off, we need to do some science on it. I mean, part of it is we need to do the science to be able to give guidance on what actually you need. But I think the way you talk about it is that you say there are limits to what you could do to the environment. That's the way I would say it. Instead of saying it's fragile, there are limits to what you could do to the environment. If you exceed those limits, you do severe damage. But the environment also can handle a lot as well. And that's sort of a different, that language isn't right either. I should have you know that NOAA, I said, NOAA has a new strategic plan, and they talk about resilience, and they had all sorts of focus groups. They haven't figured out how to talk about it. You know, so I guess I'm saying I don't know the answer to your question, but I think we'll be able to figure it out if we think about it. We do have to have a language and a way of doing it so it's not a free pass. So the fragile is wrong, the free pass is wrong. The two extremes are wrong. We need to have a language. I think we're pretty close to having a science, but we don't quite have the language yet to do it.
This might be kind of linked to that question. There's a lot of talk these days about ecosystem services, right? And trying to put, in a lot of cases, dollar signs even, you know, kind of figuring how much, you know, is this worth, right? And to kind of figure out these equations. What in your mind are some of the problems with thinking that way?
So the interesting, so I'm part of a project called the Natural Capital Project, which is an ecosystem service project. We've hired, right off the bat, 4 economists with dollar, we wrote models, we put dollar values on everything. We spent a ton of money on these economists, because economists always get paid more than other faculty. And in the end, we've done 17 projects around the world, different countries. Not once did the government or the communities ask for dollar value. Not once. So we went into it thinking, but they asked for quantification of the services or the number of people affected. So when we talk about these water funds, it's how many people are served by the water. They actually didn't need the dollar values. They needed the dollar value for the alternative. So how much a treatment plant costs managed it. So you sit there and say, a treatment plant will cost you this much, or you could spend this much to have upstream conservation. So they wanted the dollar values in terms of what I would consider managing their investment. But that's a different thing than the whole field of ecosystem services you're talking about, which is a rich scientific enterprise. And it's its own journals about it. To assign dollar values to each of these services is flourishing. I think in the end, surprisingly, you're not going to need it to the dollar value. But you do need it quantified. And you do need to be able to identify the people who are affected.
I just wonder, is there a danger, though, in that kind of trying to quantify, you have to reduce to common denominators, right? And in doing so, do you oversimplify what's actually going on in nature?
So I think, so when we present these things, we typically present them as trade-offs. We actually don't get it down to one magic number. A common critique of this movement is that oversimplification, but I don't think that critique recognizes what actually happens when it's used. It doesn't go to that simplification. And it's important to say you're willing to go to that simplification, because if you want to go in and talk to Rio Tinto or Dow, you want to be respectful of their value system. In a way, when you say you're willing to calculate dollars, you're saying, I respect your value system. And if you respect their value system, they're more likely to respect your value system. So I think it's actually more about that than it is getting to the final level. I've literally never seen it come down to a dollar number, even though we do a bunch of science to do it. Let me take up right here.
I kind of view the old computational type of conservation is kind of getting us to the point where you folks can take this new approach, and they have made that possible to some degree. So I guess my first question, do you agree? Do you still see a role for the old computational type conservation? It just, I've always thought of it as valuable because it's a counterbalance to the extremists on the other end of the spectrum.
Yeah, so I think, just like I believe in biodiversity, I believe in that type of diversity for something of the reason that you say. it's especially good early on. So early on in public awareness, activism, sort of symbolic activism, can be very, very effective. But if it continues too much, it's kind of very good for alerting you to the problem. It doesn't give you a solution. But the sad thing is that it's become so pervasive, that thing, that it's branded the whole movement. And so you need to firmly say, we care about the solutions and we'll negotiate. But I would never, frankly, I would never trash Greenpeace. Greenpeace has done some good. Greenpeace has done some good. I would never work for them. But, because it doesn't suit my style, I'd never work for them. But for part of the reason that you said, it can raise awareness.
Do you think we've overstated the case in climate change? From a scientific, kind of confrontational?
I think we stated a case in such a dumb way. The way I was talking about climate change is a stress on economic and social systems. That's what it is. It's a stress on economic, social, and natural systems. And it's a serious stress. It's a really significant stress on those systems. And now let's look at it carefully and see where, in what countries, and now let's look at that thoughtfully. And it's a really big stress. But showing a polar bear on an iceberg is emotional, and that's not really the problem. It's the problem that in some nations the agricultural food production is going to it's going to put them in a starvation. It's not going to. U.S. agriculture is going to do pretty well compared to other nations. In some nations like Bangladesh, the flooding is going to be enormous and a huge problem. In other cases, it could be diseases that are a problem. And so the way to think about it, there's a lot of stresses on economic, social, and natural systems. Climate change is a huge and pervasive one. We owe it to ourselves, as a global citizenry, to minimize that stress as much as possible, which means to address the emissions problem, and to be smart and scientific about figuring out where it's going to do the most damage and try to adapt. I don't think it's been phrased that way. I don't think it's been phrased that way. Sure.
How would you solve the spotted owl problem? I mentioned that one in particular. How would
so the spotted owl problem, have you followed biology on it? Because as you follow biology now, it appears more and more the barred owl, which is invaded, is a big part of the problem. In that day and age, I would have been more aggressive about about having alternative livelihoods for the logging community at the same time as you're proposing stopping cutting. So you have to, you can't go in there and give the impression that you don't care about the loggers. Right? It just is the wrong thing to do. And jobs. So you could solve it. It wasn't that big a thing. There are a lot of alternative livelihoods even in those areas. These are pretty small, out in the Olympic Peninsula, they're pretty small rural communities. There are a lot of sort of economic development opportunities out there that are not necessarily cutting old growth. And you would have just had those hand in hand. Those water funds that we do in the Andes, in some cases are doing things like building dairies and building fences to keep the cattle away from the rivers. So you can't just say don't. You got to give people something else to do.
I find your water funds in South America and other places interesting because they're taking more of a landscape approach to things. Are we still stuck in the United States in looking at management, conservation on a property-based way where you have a line drawn out of, we're conserving things in the park and around the parks or someplace else, doesn't matter. So when I worked for endangered species in Wisconsin, we knew a lot about state parks and national forests, and there was just a minimal outreach to the surrounding community, which was most of the state.
Yeah, you know, that, I actually think we're moving away from that. One of the sort of, I guess you'd call it the silver lining in the climate change thing, is it's forcing institutions to think at a much bigger scale. And almost every state agency and federal agency is beginning to ask, it's involved in resource management. As you get stressed by climate change, you start thinking about, well, at a bigger scale, will this species last? At a bigger, you know, it's actually forcing a much bigger landscape scale. It hasn't really been taken hold firmly in the management mandates yet, and in sort of the best practices that you know, all agencies and these things have best practices. It hasn't gotten that far yet, but I bet you within 5 years it'll be there. And I really see it as actually pushing people to have to do that. Sure.
This summer I'll be interning with the Alaska Environmental Services, which is my native corporation's environmental subsidiary, and they've tasked me with developing and implementing their environmental community outreach program. And so I have this opportunity, like you were talking about, just to get forward a minority group in conservation and environmental efforts. Where would you start with that task?
I can put you in touch with some people. I spent a lot of time in Alaska. We have a really good field office that's engaged with those communities, and I know an organizer up there. So if you give me your, you send me an email, I'll put you in touch with Randy and Augustine, and we work a lot with those communities. So, yeah. Make sure I get your email. I'll give you mine so far. You can bother me because I do bother. Sure.
Did you go down to oil toldoids with Rio Tinto?
No, I
See what
didn't.
you're doing exactly there?
No, not yet. I'm going back.
Because they're working hard to do a good job.
Yeah. Well, partly, you know, again, there's almost always government. There's almost always a government angle because the government's going to come in and regulate them as well. So it's to corporations want to minimize their transaction costs, and they want predictability. And so this was one of the amazing things when I was heavily involved in genetic engineering. And the Bush administration came out and said no regulations on biotechnology because they thought that was free. That was the best thing in the world for free enterprise. And it turned out the companies. I was working against the companies in a sense. I was very much an advocate. The companies wanted regulation because in a global environment, consistent regulation that was the same in all the countries meant that they could plan their business better. You know, and it was, you know, it just blew my mind. You know, Monsanto, all these companies, DuPont, that are involved in Cargill, that are involved in the genetically engineered, they wanted regulations because it made their business planning and their global operations better. And here there was, I think it was the, you know, what was it? It was the competitiveness committee or something that Bush had. It was some committee that was set up for, you know, competitiveness of American business. And they said, no regulation of biotechnology. And the companies go, wait a minute, we want it. And that can also happen with industries like mining. There's always mavericks. I mean, it's not like all companies behave, but it makes it, for the real international players that have to play everywhere and are in it for the long haul, it's their advantage of it. It's something I think people don't realize when they get into this nexus of environmental policy and regulation. Great, thanks.
Thank you.